Well, hello, everyone. Good afternoon, and welcome on behalf of the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia. As some of you know, I'm Douglas Northrup. I'm the acting director of the center this year. I'm also a professor of history and Middle East studies here at U of M in my day job. Before I introduce today's event, the lecture, just one quick word about another upcoming event that you've seen on the screen. We have it on March 19th jointly with Wallace House, a program in Rackham Amphitheater covering migration in Europe, displacement, trauma, and reporting on vulnerable sources. That's a panel discussion with 3 of this year's Knight Wallace Fellows, journalists who have come to Michigan from other parts of the world to reflect upon and study these issues more fully. Now the main event for today. We're calling this the first of a series of emerging issues lectures. It's a new framework that has been created to bring into view topics that are urgent and which the public needs to know better, topics that have not been as well covered in our local resources here at U of M. And in this case, I suspect very few of you in the room need me much help figuring out how the topic why Greenland matters now, matters in a suddenly new way. It's a topic that's been all over the news, as we all know, to a stunning degree in the last few months. And I must say, talk about choosing to study a topic at the most propitious possible moment to do a postdoctoral fellowship. That is our visitor today. We're grateful to our co-sponsors, that's CREASE, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies here at Michigan, also the Ford School for Public Policy, the School for Environment and Sustainability, also in LSA, our home college, the Department of Political Science, and the Scandinavian Studies Program, which is located in Germanic languages and literatures. Our speaker, Dr. Gabriella Gricius, is the perfect guide to illuminate this sharply emerging issue in the world today. She is one of the world's experts on Greenland. She is a senior fellow at the Arctic Institute. She is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Konstanz, where she's working on Nordic security communities and hybrid threats across the European Arctic. That all builds on her doctoral work. She did a PhD in political science at Colorado State University, which focused on Greenland in part, also on Svalbard, and the Northern Sea Route and the Northwest Passage, all these issues connected in the Arctic lands. Her writing has been widely published already in foreign policy, international politics, European security, to mention just a few. And then beyond that, as you might guess, she has been wildly in demand by the media for reasons you all probably know, having been interviewed by the BBC, the New York Times, to name just a couple, and many others as well. We were very fortunate that she was able to fit us into her suddenly unimaginably hectic schedule for this visit to Ann Arbor, and I hope you will join me in giving her a very warm Michigan welcome.
Well, thank you so much for that really kind introduction. I hope you can all hear me okay with the microphone. Amazing. So today I'm going to start by walking us through a discussion of why the Arctic seems to be suddenly important for the first time, although it's been important for a long time. And then we're going to move to talking about Greenland. But before I jump into where the Arctic came from, I find it's always really useful to start with a map. Because when we think about the Arctic, it sounds of these northern reaches somewhere in the distance. But it's actually very close to home for a lot of us. And so in the Arctic space, when we speak about the Arctic, we don't just talk about one region. We actually talk about 3 separate parts of the Arctic. We speak about, on one hand, the North American Arctic, which encompasses Alaska, Canada, and Greenland, areas where we don't see as much infrastructure, more rural, in contrast to the European Arctic, which you can see is above the European continent, so relatively small, but has significantly more infrastructure and many more people as well, living in much more proximity to southern capitals. And then lastly, of course, the Russian Arctic, an important area that makes up more than 50% of the Arctic region. But the Arctic, of course, didn't just become important because Donald Trump decided to talk about it in 2019. It's been important for a really long time. Going back many years, but for the purposes of this presentation, we're going to start in the Cold War. And so while there was no threats in the Arctic, many of these threats moved through the region. So east-west militarization was part of the reason why this part of the world became important. And so initially, it was talked about as being the shortest aerial route between the US and the Soviet Union. What that meant for both states was that they were concerned about nuclear threats coming from across the horizon. And so that meant the development of long-range bombers. It meant the development of missile defense lines across different parts of the northern spaces. And then later, as technology developed, it became important from a maritime capacity as nuclear submarines traversed underneath the sea ice, carrying in many cases secondary strike capabilities for both powers. But then came the end of the Cold War, and the Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev gave a speech in 1987 called the Murmansk Speech. And in it, he talked about wanting to create a peaceful Arctic. No nuclear weapons, scientific cooperation, allowing indigenous groups to meet from across the Iron Curtain. And of course, Western states didn't just take this without a grain of salt. They said, yeah, we're not so sure about this speech. But still, some groups decided to seize upon it. And it started with those in Finland. So people from the Finnish Ministry of the Environment, as well as the Foreign Ministry, came together to say, we need to seize this opportunity because there are challenges that stretch across different national boundaries in the region. Things like transboundary pollution from nuclear testing, for example, or large-range heavy shipping in certain parts of the Arctic. And so they proposed that all Arctic states should meet together. And so this was initially called the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy. And after this was initially signed, put together in the early 90s, some Canadian representatives came up and they said, perhaps we should codify this a bit more. And it ended in what we now think of as the Arctic Council, which is an intergovernmental forum between all 8 Arctic states, as well as Indigenous permanent participant members. And it's important to note that this council doesn't have true decision-making ability. It can't force states to do anything. But it's an institution that has faced serious challenges since 2022, but does continue to play an important role in the Arctic. And when we talk about the Arctic, we often say, is it special? Is it exceptional in some way? And some people say, yeah, it can be exceptional. Some people say it has to do with the climate, that its position in connection to the global climate system is hugely important. What happens in the Arctic doesn't just stay in the Arctic, but it influences spaces like here, for example, where we have unpredictable weather, as well as across Europe as well. But we also talk about the Arctic as exceptional when it comes to its politics, that even though there was a lot of military development in terms of missile defense systems, the bombers I discussed, as well as submarines, it didn't see conflict. There was no real kinetic conflict during the Cold War period. And then lastly, some people talk about the Arctic Council as exceptional, that it's one of the rare places where we see Indigenous people having a permanent role. But exceptionalism hasn't lasted forever. And so while this was the narrative at the beginning of the 2000s, this quickly began to fade away. And the start of that actually came earlier than you would think, in 2007, when a Russian scientific mission planted a titanium Russian flag on the bottom of the ocean floor. Now, of course, this wasn't a territory grab per se, but rather it was a scientist in a Russian state-backed scientific expedition that went out to try to claim a part of the Lomonosov Ridge, trying to claim scientific evidence that would allow the Russian state to say, well, this is actually part of Russia, and therefore our area of the maritime that we are allowed to exploit is perhaps larger than you might otherwise anticipate. And there was some pushback by Arctic states, but actually, instead what happened is that the Arctic coastal states, so states within the Arctic Circle that have on the Arctic Central Ocean, they actually released a declaration known as the Ilulissat Declaration, saying that there's not a scramble for Arctic resources while other states perhaps were interested. They said, we have governance in the Arctic. We don't need outsiders coming in to talk about any of these things. But it began what many people talk about as scramble narratives. People were interested in resources, shipping. What did this look like in the Arctic? It's an exciting new world. But what I want to talk about now is what are some dynamics that are going on in the region. And I want to start with talking about shipping, which you've probably read quite a lot about, or you've seen it in the news come up several times. And so when it comes to shipping, there are three possible routes that one could conceivably, in a future plausible 2050, 2075 world, that you could take. There's the Northern Sea route, which runs very close to the Russian border. And as you can see, it would be much faster than the current route that goes through the Suez Canal and the Straits of Malacca. And this is used to some extent by inter-Russian communities in the Arctic, and China is increasingly using it on a more regular basis. Then we have the transpolar route, which would run directly through the center of the Arctic Circle, which, as you can imagine, is not an option right now, given that there's still a vast amount of sea ice there. But marine planners are still talking about this as something that could happen in the future. And then lastly, we have the Northwest Passage. And the Northwest Passage runs very tightly in the Canadian Arctic archipelago. And so I find it interesting when we speak about shipping, people say, all of these routes, so many opportunities to take, but really there's only one that's used seriously, and that's the Northern Sea route. And to give you some context, around 100 or so vessels were able to navigate fully through the Northern Sea route last year, whereas in the Northwest Passage, only a handful actually fully traversed. And a lot of the shipping has to do with local resupply rather than full scale through the region. But of course, when it comes to shipping, this also raises questions about Indigenous rights. It's not just about, can we get through really quickly? Can we use this as economic opportunity? But what about rural communities that are very close to some of these borders? How are they deal with increased marine noise, for example, or threats to their traditional livelihoods? These are open questions, of course. The other narrative that's come up quite a lot has to do with resources. And so I mentioned already that some have spoken about a scramble for Arctic resources. And it's important to say that this is not happening, that although there's an interest from many states, like BRICS nations, for example, coming interested in the region, most of the Arctic resources actually fall within countries' exclusive economic zones, meaning that India can't just come in and grab a bunch of resources from Alaska, for example, or Russia. But these numbers that have been talked about since 2008 make the Arctic really exciting for states. 90 billion barrels of oil, a fifth of the world's natural gas. So states that are not so familiar with the Arctic hear these and they think, we want to be involved as well. But of course, we have to again come back to who's living in the Arctic? Where are these resources located? In many cases, near to rural and local Indigenous communities who need to have a say in the development if they even want such resources to be developed. Another common language that we see when we talk about the Arctic is critical minerals and rare earth resources. And of course, critical minerals here, we're talking about elements that are essential for things like F-35s, defense materials, electric cars, and even our smartphones, many of which we need in our day-to-day society. And in the Arctic, but particularly in Greenland, there can be high concentrations of these across the regions in very different ways. But even if these resources might be interesting for us to obtain, they're often very challenging to get through. They're logistically difficult. How are we mining these things? Do we have the environmental know-how to do so? And how are we transporting these resources from the point of extraction to actually moving them out? We have also the harsh climate, the brutal weather. How is equipment for mining actually able to withstand these really harsh temperatures? So while exciting, seeing these numbers, I think, makes people think, wow, we can really use this opportunity here. It's important to come back to the reality of what this looks like on the ground. Of course, what I haven't spoken about, which is the most important thing to talk about in the Arctic, is climate change, which is the greatest security threat in the region by far. And this happens on a variety of different levels. We can talk about first on a very local level. For some people, for example, in Alaska local communities, they're having to engage in a process known as managed retreat, where they are quite literally having to pick up their homes and move them away from the coast. And as you can imagine, this would be traumatic here in Ann Arbor, but it would also be even more traumatic if we had food security, cultural, and society security implications to imagine as well. So that's the most local level. Imagine that a community also has to deal with the fact that traditional hunting practices or fishing practices are impacted. Fish are moving in different places. In some cases, we've seen events where reindeer cannot access the lichen that they need in order to continue living in certain parts of the Arctic. And then on a military level, much of the infrastructure in the Arctic is built on permafrost, essentially frozen ground. And so as temperatures are becoming warmer in the region, much of this infrastructure is under threat. Things like roads, things like ports, not only useful for communities, but essential for defense and security purposes as well. And then there's the fact that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay there. So as we see increased warming in the Arctic, that has downstream effects for other parts of the world as well. So although in the next slide I'm going to talk about great power competition, bring it back to these big states, I think it's really important to highlight here that this is the largest threat to the region by far. But of course, when we speak about geopolitical competition, we have to talk about these big three powers, the US, Russia, and China. And counterintuitively, I don't want to start with the United States, because in the Arctic, it plays a relatively minor role to some of the other Arctic states. Instead, I want to start by talking about Russia. So Russia has the vast majority of territory in the Arctic, and it also has had the most investment in the space. It's engaged in building up shipping infrastructure, heavy industry as well. But it's not only commercial, because of course for Russia, it is where the secondary strike capability, their nuclear capacity, is on the Kola Peninsula. So it's commercially important, it's strategically important, and it also is important from an identity perspective. For Russia, the Arctic is essential to its future economic growth, and it sees the region as this way to extract more oil, extract more gas, and cultivate a relationship with China as well, that it seeks to use for financial purposes to build up its own capacity. By contrast, we have the United States, which I like to think of as a very reactive Arctic power. So although of course there has been an Arctic strategy in the past, it wasn't until around 2019 that we began seeing quite a lot of movement inside of the US administration. At an Arctic Council meeting, then Secretary of State Mike Pompeo spoke about the region being a theater of geopolitical competition. And this was followed by a variety of strategies and outlook documents from every single branch of the US Armed Forces, which is the first time that this has happened for a specific region in US history. But for the US, who hasn't invested in the Arctic, doesn't have the same sort of expertise apart from some specific military bodies within their armed forces, it doesn't have the same sort of ability to operate in the Arctic as other states. To give you a concrete example of this, Russia has its estimated between 40 and 50 icebreakers. Not all of these are military, some of these are much smaller, able to get through sea ice in certain parts of the Northern Sea Route. The US has 3 currently, and they just recently bought the 3rd one, so it's a new purchase. By contrast, we have China. So China has 5 icebreakers. And you might be asking, why are we speaking about China? China's not in the Arctic Circle, of course. But in 2018, it released a white paper where it called itself a near-Arctic power. Obviously, we don't have a map. Well, we have the map here, so China's not here in the Arctic. But this caused a huge uproar by small Arctic states who said, why are you interested in this region at all? But for China, the Arctic plays a couple of different roles. And the first is strategic. So for China, it sees the US in the Arctic, it sees Russia, these other powers, and it says, as a self-proclaimed great power itself, we also should be in this space. We want to play a role in what we see as this next strategic frontier. But of course, commercial interests play a really important role for China as well. It sees the region as a way to ship items much more quickly from China all the way to Europe. And of course, sees accessing the energy there, specifically LNG, as a good way to deal with energy security concerns that it has. And of course, people say, and we'll get to this later, one of Trump's claims was that China is, threatening Greenland, and that's why we have to protect it. But there's some interesting research out that talks about, does China actually have as big of a presence in the Arctic as we think? And the answer is no. it does have some degree of presence in the Arctic, but actually much of its advances to smaller Arctic states have been relatively rebuffed. States are not interested, smaller companies have ended up not working with them in the long term. So certainly they're in the Arctic, certainly they play an important role, but not in the way that we might anticipate. So moving then to talking about Denmark and Greenland, that's why we're here, right, to learn a bit about Greenland. When we talk about what Greenland actually is, it's important to start by saying that they are the third part of the Kingdom of Denmark. So we have the Kingdom of Denmark at the top, which has three constituent parts. We have Denmark, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands. And both the Faroe Islands and Greenland have what they're called autonomous sovereignty, meaning that they're responsible for the vast degree of everything that goes on within their borders. And interestingly, when it comes to how Denmark has been involved in the Arctic, although they have Greenland as the claim through which they become an Arctic state, they haven't released an Arctic strategy since 2011, which just kind of goes to show you that certainly it plays a role for them, but not nearly as an important role as we might expect. And Greenland was initially a colony of the Kingdom of Denmark. It later in the 1950s transitioned to becoming a county. And unfortunately, this wasn't good news for many people living in Greenland, as it meant that they were subject to a variety of Danification policies, which were very imperial, colonial tactics. Things like taking Greenlandic children from Greenland to Denmark to better families to be integrated, or sterilizing Greenlandic women. So some of these, of course, consequences are still with us today when we think about the Greenland-Danish relationship. But this actually led to a push for independence for many people in Greenland. They said, we don't like this situation, we want an increased degree of autonomy. And so in 1979, Greenland established its own parliament as part of what's called Home Rule. And it took control of a variety of internal affairs like education as well as the environment. This advanced even further in 2009 under the Self-Government Act, which was a landmark shift where Greenlanders were recognized as a separate people under international law. And they also gained control of pretty much every competency area except for two areas, foreign policy and security, where continually Denmark does have competence in these areas, meaning that if something happens, Greenland can of course respond, but the legal precedent means that Denmark would be able to take that full response if they wanted to. Although of course, that would come with serious consequences for their relationship with Greenland as well. Of course, we want to also mention here that an important aspect of Greenland is that they are 90% Inuit. And so the way that the government works is much more indigenous than other parts of the world. And why Greenland is important from a strategic perspective, although we'll get to that in a second, has to do with something known as the GI-UK gap, so the Greenland-Iceland-UK gap. And part of the reason this plays strategic relevance, not only for the United States, but also for Europe, is that it's a strategic choke point. And I think you can see right here that on the other side of that map is Russia and Murmansk, which is where Russia's northern fleet is, as well as their nuclear submarines. Meaning that if those ships, those submarines, want to exit into the North Atlantic, they have to go through one of these areas. Meaning that for states trying to understand those types of movements, they have to monitor this. So Greenland has a real degree of strategic importance for a variety of different countries. So I mentioned already that Greenland started this independence path really sizably in 2009, but they faced real challenges in becoming independent for a lot of different reasons. And the most important reason has to do with the block grant. And the block grant is money that they receive from the Kingdom of Denmark. And this money covers things like social services, everything that the government can perhaps not pay for because they simply don't have the same type of GDP as a bigger state, for example. And so it's estimated to be around 600 million USD, although it does change year to year depending on what Greenland is able to pay for from other types of revenue. So how does Greenland make up that money? Right? They have some options. They could mine critical minerals, for example. They could engage in more extractive practices on Greenland. They could also use fishing as a way to get more resources, or tourism, for example. So there's lots of different routes here, but being able to obtain that amount of money takes time. And it begs the question of what partners are we going to seek out to do this? Will it be the European Union, of which Greenland is not a part, even though Denmark is a part of it? Or will it be a state like China, which has, of course, raises questions for its security? The second challenge for independence actually has to do with NATO. And I'll show in a couple slides, a map of all the different bases during the Cold War on Greenland. But needless to say, it's in a really important place when it comes to maritime surveillance, but also aerial and space surveillance across, again, that horizon where we can see missiles coming from our adversaries. And so let's imagine that Greenland gains independence. There's a question for some allies, specifically the United States, of, well, would Greenland naturally become a member of NATO? If so, that's great. We've solved the issue. We can keep the military infrastructure there. Defense of North America, the Atlantic, and Europe is fine. But if Greenland chose not to become a part of NATO, what would happen to this strategic picture? Where would radars be placed to monitor, again, that GIA-UK gap? How would the defense of North America be impacted by this? And Greenlandic leaders have said that this is kind of a straw man argument, that if they were to gain independence, they would join NATO, it wouldn't be a problem. But would they then contribute 2% of their GDP to defense as other NATO members, or what would that look like? So this is an open question that's continuing to be mediated. And it's important to state here that when it comes to the future of Greenland, it lies with the people of Greenland themselves. So the most important statement that is on their foreign policy and Arctic document that they came out with in 2024 is nothing about us without us. Greenlanders themselves need to be part of the discussion of where their future is going, not the Kingdom of Denmark, not the United States, and certainly no other states as well. If independence were to be the next step in the process, what would it start with? It would start with a referendum, where Greenlanders would vote on the fact that indeed they wish to pursue independence. That would then turn to an interparliamentary negotiation between the Greenlandic as well as the Danish parliaments, coming together to talk about what would that agreement look like. And then we, of course, have to ask the question, does Denmark want Greenland to be independent? Danish politicians claim that they support Greenland. If Greenland wants to be independent, they want to be a part of that process as well. But again, come back to the fact that for Denmark, Greenland is the ticket to Arctic identity, to being a part of this region. And so we have to ask, what exactly would that negotiating process look like? How long would it go on for? And what are some of the trade-offs that might have to be negotiated for this to happen? So what it comes down to is not so much a question of when, but rather how. Because Greenlanders seek independence. They do want it in the long run. But the situation with the United States over the past few years had led many to ask, are we not more vulnerable if we're independent? Right now, we're under the Kingdom of Denmark. We have support from the EU. But to be a new sovereign state in the international system is perhaps a much more vulnerable place to be than allied with Denmark. I mentioned that one possible way that Greenland could obtain more money through trade could be through a relationship with China. And actually, Greenlandic politicians sought to do this in 2009 and 2010. They sent envoys to Beijing to see whether there would be an opportunity to work with them on fishing, for example, as well as perhaps more extractive industries on Greenland itself. But much of this actually failed. And a lot of it has to do with the challenge of mining, which we already mentioned is something that plays a really important role in the Arctic. And so there's only one mining project that remains today on Greenland, and it's actually quite stymied from China's investment. And this has to do with the fact that in 2021, the Greenlandic parliament banned uranium mining, or at least mining uranium to a very small degree. And you might say, well, is uranium everywhere on Greenland? No, but the problem with critical minerals is that many of these are co-developed with uranium. And so extracting critical minerals means that there will be some degree of uranium there, meaning that projects like Kvanefjeld, the one that continues to exist, face real hurdles at the moment. That said, China does continue to be a key market for Greenlandic fishing exports. And two incidents did happen in 2016 and 2018 that led many in the United States and Denmark to be very wary of China. And this had to do that with a Chinese state company wanted to buy first a decommissioned naval base and then later wanted to revamp an airport in Greenland. And so you might say that this is just a state company, they want to invest, they want to help provide infrastructure for Greenland. But for Denmark, for the United States, this rang a lot of warning bells. They said, this seems very similar to debt trap diplomacy that we've seen in other parts of Africa. What exactly is that relationship going to look like between the Greenlandic government and the Chinese government? And so what happened was Greenland faced quite a lot of pressure from the US, from Denmark, to take a step back from those projects. And instead, Danish investment, as well as in some cases US investment, was able to come through and help conduct these projects in the end. But when we talk about Greenland, I think we're all thinking about the United States. Why does Greenland matter for the US? When we push aside all of the claims of why Trump needs it, Greenland does really matter for North American security and for the US homeland defense. And we already mentioned the GI-UK gap, but of course this really has to do with aerial and space surveillance, because missiles, hypersonic or ballistic, come across the Arctic area. And so monitoring these from then Thule, now Pituffik Space Base, is really important, not only for American national security, but also for Canadian as well. And that's part of the way that Canada and the US work together in NORAD, the binational US and Canadian defense system. So for Homeland Defense, it does play an important role. And so when speaking about kind of pushing back against these myths of why the US doesn't need to buy Greenland, it's important to start with, well, we don't need to buy Greenland. We understand these strategic realities, and we have status there since 1951, or really officially since 1941. And so during World War II, there was a lot of concern from the US and allies in Europe that the Nazis could use Greenland as a stepping stone to then come over to the United States. And so a Danish ambassador came over to the US and they conducted this very kind of shady deal where he said, you can come in, you can place as many military resources as you need, but we want it defended. We want to make sure that the US continues to have protection here. So this was then codified in 1951 in the Defense Agreement. And in short, the Defense Agreement says that the US can place whatever military resources it wants on Greenland, it can move troops there, it can do pretty much whatever it wants to do on Greenland with the agreement of the Danish government, and later in 2004 when it was renegotiated to be a trilateral agreement with the government of Greenland, with the agreement of Greenland as well. And so certainly during the Cold War, the US had many bases on Greenland. They stationed troops there, they had bombers that ran through the area, and there was several situations which were relatively negative towards the people of Greenland. The first had to do with the actual construction of Thule Air Base, now Pituffik Space Base, where in establishing the base, the Danish government, under pressure from the US, actually forcibly displaced Greenlandic populations from that area, moving them to other parts of Greenland. So this, of course, did not create a lot of goodwill with the people of Greenland. But then later, we also saw challenges when it came to the double standard policy. And the double standard policy essentially was that Denmark, during the Cold War and part of its relationship with NATO, banned the stationing of nuclear weapons on its territory. But this was not true in Greenland, where they said, you could probably have nuclear weapons here, but we're not going to talk about it. We're just going to have this be a low issue that you do. And this might have been okay, but in 1968, there was a crash of a US B-52 bomber that was carrying 4 hydrogen bombs near to Thule, and it led to some radiation challenges there. So this has had a longer history over time. And the US still uses Pituffik Space Base, and as you can see, it's the only one that is still open right now, which leads many to ask, when it comes to Trump, surely you could just open new bases under the defense agreement rather than buying the island altogether, and again, from who? I mentioned, of course, that critical minerals and rare earths play an important role when we're talking about the changing environment in the Arctic, and it's certainly relevant when we speak about Greenland itself. Greenland is 8th in the world when it comes to rare earths, and it has around 1.5 million metric tons of them. Many of them are concentrated in the south of Greenland, but as I mentioned, It's really challenging to move these minerals from one place to another. There's no railroad to move them across Greenland. Also, with the uranium ban now, it means that many of these mines are no longer operational, or they can't be continued to conducted under the ban. But that said, of course, for the US, this presents a really interesting opportunity, because 43 out of the 50 strategic minerals that the US has are on Greenland. So of course, it's an area of interest to them. But as I mentioned, of course, when it comes to uranium, this is something that is a challenge. It's not necessarily that we're all seeking to mine uranium, but it is really prevalent all over the island. And so really getting at those minerals is an issue. But it raises really interesting questions of competencies between Denmark and Greenland. On the one hand, extraction projects clearly are a national competency. It falls within that economic, that environmental, that all of these issues from a domestic standpoint. So Greenland should have competence in doing this. But it, of course, is also a question of foreign policy. It's also a question of security. If a Chinese company wants to come in to mine these resources, this is a security question. And then if Greenland seeks to have partnerships with other states, also raises questions of foreign policy as well. So there have been tussles in the past between the two actors to determine who actually does have competence in this space. Part of the reason why uranium was banned in 2021 from being mined has to do with the environmental costs as well. So there's radioactive dust that can come up from the ground when uranium is being mined. And of course, the waste material also plays an important role as to why Greenlanders themselves are not interested in pushing this forward. But the Greenland drama, of course, didn't just start in 2026 or 2025, but actually as early as 2019, when Trump in his first term talked about buying Greenland, this amazing real estate deal that he could help conduct for the United States. And at the time, Danish Greenlandic leaders pushed this aside. They said, this is ridiculous. You know, is this a joke? What are we talking about here? But of course, the issue was raised again in 2025 and again in 2026, each time more serious than the last. It was no longer a real estate deal, but rather a need for US national security, and then something that would not be ruled out with military force. So of course, the reaction needed to be much more serious this time. And now we have seen a lot more push, not only from Denmark and Greenland working together, but also all of Europe as well. And something that Denmark did this time, which I thought was really smart, was rather than making this a bilateral or a trilateral question between those three parties, they made it a question of NATO. And so now it's not just this North Atlantic issue, but all across the Arctic as well. So why, let's talk about some of the reasons and, push out some myths about why the US does not need Greenland. The first reason that came up multiple times has to do with national security. At the beginning, Trump talked about there being Russian and Chinese ships off the coast of Greenland, that they were threatening Greenlandic sovereignty and thus US national security. There were no ships in Greenlandic waters. If we want to talk about Russian and Chinese ships practicing together, this is certainly happening in the Arctic. And this is why it's so important to say, where in the Arctic do we mean? Not in the North American Arctic where Greenland is, but in the Bering Strait on the other side of the United States. So if we're going to speak about Russian and Chinese cooperation, we should talk about investing money in critical infrastructure in Alaska, understanding better surveillance tactics, and understanding why Russia and China might seek to practice in this important operational seam for US national defense. The second rationale had to do with Russia and China potentially taking over Greenland, the way that they might be able to overrun the government. And so again, this is not what's happening. For Russia and China, Greenland is very close to the US. And in actually taking over Greenland, this would be a huge threat to the US and wouldn't make sense strategically, either from Russia or from China. The third rationale was that the US needed Greenland for what he calls the Golden Dome Project. And so the Golden Dome Project is a proposed missile defense system. And it's exactly what it sounds like, a huge dome over North America, very Star Wars, very thinking about these science fiction terms here. And the idea is that we would have these little interceptor stations all over Canada, parts of California, Alaska, and certain parts of the East Coast as well, that we would be able to see and detect hypersonic, space missiles, these very, I don't know, all these types of weapons. But the US doesn't necessarily need interceptor sites on Greenland to do this. In fact, they were not planned to be there at all. There are some in Canada, there are some on the East Coast and the West Coast, and certainly they could be in Greenland. But again, the question becomes, you don't need to buy Greenland in order to set up interceptor sites. As we said already, under the 1951 Defense Agreement, you can place those there, in agreement with Greenland, in agreement with Denmark as well. The second rationale has to do with critical minerals. And while the administration has gone to great lengths to say that this is not a question of extracting these resources, we can all, I think, read between the lines that it's certainly a variable in how the US has spoken about its interest in the Arctic. And actually, the most recently published maritime strategy talks about gaining resources in the Arctic space as part of the way that the US is interested in expanding its presence there. So, yes, climate change is making certain parts of Greenland more accessible than they have been in the past, but we have to think about the logistical challenges of obtaining these critical minerals, and of course, the assent of a local population. If it is to be that the US and Greenland work together on these things, this would require a bilateral agreement, something between companies, which can and has already happened between Greenlandic actors and US businesses. So not something that one needs to buy an island for, but rather a future agreement that could be made with one another on a local as well as a national level. The third rationale we could speak of is, of course, imperialist ambitions. The US has come out with a hemispheric foreign policy doctrine where they talk about wanting to gain control over the entire hemisphere. There's also the language of this Donroe Doctrine, similar to the Monroe Doctrine. But this, even so, when we talk about influence of the US, the Monroe Doctrine itself never spoke about taking territory and actually putting it under US national interests. So again, it's hard to read into the minds of national leaders. We can't say for sure what Trump or other US administration officials are thinking about this. But certainly it's a possible reason that some scholars and observers of the issues have spoken of in the past. Chinese investment also comes up a lot when we speak about why the administration is interested in Greenland. And as we already showed, this is limited. The way that China is on Greenland is there. There's no question about it. But it's not to the same extent that the administration is painting it as. In fact, their engagement is relatively limited compared to how they've invested in other parts of the Arctic as well. What we can agree on is that the dynamics of security in the Arctic are changing. And this is what the administration has said, and this is exactly what Danish politicians have touched on as well. That if we are to agree on something, let's talk about the fact that there are increased hybrid threats in the European Arctic. Let's talk about climate change as impacting military infrastructure and wanting to engage more with our partners and allies, particularly with Finland and Sweden as part of the NATO alliance. These things we can all agree on. And so is the crisis averted? What do we know actually right now? We know some simple things, such as Greenlanders do not want to be bought by anyone. In a poll conducted by the University of Greenland and the Konrad Adenauer Stiftung in 2025, 85% of Greenlanders said they did not want to be a part of the United States. Very clearly, do not want to be a part of us. So easy crisis to avert from that perspective. But also what we know is Denmark doesn't have the authority to sell Greenland. It's in the hands of the Greenlanders themselves to decide where and how they want their future to be. Trump has said that he will not use force to take Greenland, which I think is a huge kind of sigh of relief for everyone, although we never know what's coming next. It's an unpredictable environment. And what we have seen is that to respond, instead of working with Trump directly, Denmark and Greenland have instead turned to NATO as a possible way to deal with this issue, and the recently launched Arctic Sentry Initiative. And so this is a NATO operation similar to Baltic Sentry or Eastern Sentry. And the idea here is to take a variety of different activities that are already happening and put them all under one hat. So exercises like cold response, for example, a Norwegian-hosted military exercise that's been going on since 2006, a Danish military exercise known as Arctic Endurance. These things are now under Arctic Sentry. Some people might ask, rightfully so, do we really need increased visibility in the Arctic? We do, but again, where? in the Arctic do we need visibility? In the North Atlantic space near Greenland, we don't see traditional threats, things like Russian and Chinese ships. What we do see is threats in the European side of the Arctic, where there is increasing kinetic under the threshold challenges. Things like ships dragging their anchor along the bottom of the ocean floor, accidentally disrupting key telecommunications and oil and gas cables. Things like GPS jamming become increasingly prevalent in parts of the Barents Sea as well as the Baltic Sea. Disinformation, cyber attacks, many of these things are having a real impact there. And so when we talk about Arctic Sentry, it's no question that NATO is seeing an increased role for itself in the Arctic, but how and through what mechanisms is this going to happen is the next question that we should be asking ourselves when we're talking about this region. What we know about the current deal is that it's kind of hazy at the moment. It's left the headlines for right now, where we're busy hearing about Iran or the Epstein files or whatever new news issue has come to the tables. But what we have heard is a couple of statements from Danish and Greenlandic politicians which concerningly mention that they don't seem to be a part of a lot of the discussions, this deal that the US is working together with NATO, who doesn't have the authority to deal with the future of Greenland. But in lieu, Trump has mentioned that he has total access to Greenland, whatever this might mean. Is this a pull away, kind of a de-escalatory approach where, yes, the US has access through the 1951 agreement, and so going back, or is this some other deal that's currently being discussed? And one way we might want to say we don't know where this is going has to do with the fact that the press conference that came up right after the crisis, when a Trump administration official came forward saying that the talks that the three parties were engaged in were about buying Greenland, the technical aspects of this, whereas Danish and Greenlandic politicians came forward and said, well, this is not what's being discussed. The talks are to talk about Arctic security, where we can continue to cooperate together. So clearly there are divergent perspectives in how we're approaching this issue, but it seems for right now that all the parties involved don't want this to be top of the news headlines where we're all reading, trying to determine what's happening next. What we do know is that this is good news for Russia and China. Adversaries of the NATO alliance, they're excited to see allies bickering amongst each other. So actually for both of these states, they say, we're taking a step back. Let the US do what it wants when it comes to Greenland. This is perfectly fine. So they're happy, and there has been significant damage done to the transatlantic alliance. For not only the US, but also for Europe, there's now a lack of trust here. Can Europe trust, for example, that Allied reinforcements will indeed arrive from the US if something is to happen on Finland's long border with Russia? Presumably, yes, we can expect this because of the long military cooperation between both sides, but it raises questions about how we should think about this in the future and to what degree Europe might want to make plans for how it should deal with being more independent, more strategic by itself and not rely on the US as much. But Greenland clearly plays a really important role in how we not only think about environmental issues, geopolitical issues, economic and environmental issues as well, but it also is a microcosm for how we think about the Arctic, where we can't talk about any of these things in isolation with one another. So I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
We have time for questions from the group. We'll have a couple of microphones working their way up and down the aisles, so please raise your hands if you'd like to ask, and Dr. Gricius will call on people herself.
Sure, go ahead.
Hi, I was wondering if you had any recommendations on how to strengthen the transatlantic alliance after everything that's happened with Greenland.
I think what I would say when it comes to strengthening the alliance is it has to do with understanding where and how we can strengthen. So is it through presence engagement? They're doing more, perhaps, presence missions around critical infrastructure? Or does it have to do with confidence building exercises where we need to actually have people be in the room together? Unfortunately, I think the current administration is a big challenge for many European states because they're not sure what's coming next. But we can't just think that, well, once Trump has his second term, we're going to go back to normal, whatever normal might mean. So I think it's a question for Europe to understand, do they want there to be a Europe-based NATO where they take more primary control for their security or not? No. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thanks. In studying the history of the Cold War, it's hard to avoid the conclusion, at least for me, that a lot of the problem was that the two major powers, the United States and Russia, insisted upon interpreting whatever the other side did in the worst possible way. The Russians felt like they were entitled to have a sphere of influence in Eastern Europe, just like the United States had since 1823 in the Western Hemisphere with the Monroe Doctrine. All other powers stay out. The Russians had been invaded in the 20th century twice by Germany from the West, by Napoleon in the 19th century, and by Sweden, believe it or not, which used to be a major power in the 17th century. The United States interpreted Russia's desire, what they claimed their desire for friendly powers to provide a sphere of influence on their West, as just an excuse that they actually were planning to invade Western Europe. And the Russians interpreted the United States that was all hooey, that the United States was planning to invade Russia, and that's why they didn't want any friendly powers. And it seems to me this just happened over and over again. And it seems to me that a lot of it's a similar problem here. I think there are a number of people in the room here old enough like me to remember the Sputnik scare. In 1957, the Russians, I think they orbited the moon with a satellite, I believe. And the United States thought the Russians were planning to get a base on the moon and use it to attack the United States, because that's what we would have done if we could have done that. And I think it's just the same thing happening over and over again. And we're just never going to have a peaceful world as long as each power views the other in the worst possible light. So I'd just like to hear your comment on that.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think it's definitely a challenge when it's so adversarial, right? Where we really see these two sides as always, what's the worst thing they could do? And you always assume this approach. I think the Arctic in the past has been an example where we have seen low-level cooperation, even during the Cold War, between some scientists, even while we were assuming all of these horrible things about the other. And so I think when it comes to avoiding this in the future, perhaps it's not about avoiding the structural reality of it, but understanding how do we work within that structural reality. We can't, any one of us alone, go to Washington, D.C. and tell leaders, hey, let's focus on climate change. Let's focus on our shared threat here. But what we can do is say, what are small-scale issues that we can still work on in the Arctic despite challenges? Black carbon pollution, for example, things like how do we address shipping safety in the region? So when I am focused on these really pessimistic structural dynamics, I try to bring it down to the reality. But I absolutely agree with you.
Hi. I'm not sure which version of this question is more interesting, so I guess answer the more fun one. Where does Canada fit in? In one version, as a geopolitical actor in the register you've been speaking about, or it's also got an Inuit government that has a historically rough relationship with its metropoles.
Yeah, Canada's a really important actor in the Arctic. I think when I'm thinking about their role, I often think of it as one of strategic neglect, where Canada, while it considers itself an Arctic actor, most of its population lives in the south, near to the border with the United States. And so they haven't put the same degree of investment into Nunavut, for example, as other parts of the region. I think, on the other hand, we see Indigenous rights play perhaps a stronger role in Canada than we do other parts of the Arctic. There's much more organization, there's much more focus there. But when I think of Canada, I think Canada is in a really precarious situation right now, geopolitically. It's, on the one hand, bless you, it has a close relationship with the United States, and that relationship isn't going anywhere anytime soon. But at the same time, I think Canada sees the way that Trump talks about Greenland and says, a lot of these things could be said about Canada too. So where is Canada supposed to go? And we've actually seen a big movement towards Canada trying to build relationships with Nordic states, trying to say, how should like-minded Arctic states, except for the US and Russia, begin to cooperate together? And we've seen submarine deals, for example, between Canada, Germany, and Norway. Actually, I think Carney is going to Northern Norway for the first time this week, which just tells you that they do see the Arctic as important as well.
Hi, thank you. This was a really interesting talk, and I appreciate you being here to tell us about Greenland. I think when there was that news frenzy about what Trump had said about taking over Greenland or buying Greenland, we saw J.D. Vance give a speech about how Greenland or Denmark had neglected Greenland, and we saw, I think Denmark pledged an additional amount of money for like medevacs and infrastructure in Greenland. And I guess I'm curious if you've noticed any like changes in the relationship between Denmark and Greenland because of this, and if you could expand a little bit on what it looks like maybe on the ground for that tense relationship.
Absolutely. So actually, since 2017, Greenlanders have actually been a part of Denmark's defense discussions. So it actually predates a lot of the drama about it, and they've been an increasing part of talks about this security. But when it comes to how Denmark, I would agree in a way that Denmark has strategically neglected Greenland, but at the same time, to what traditional threats are we responding to? I think there's been a neglect in terms of infrastructure investment, absolutely. But Denmark, I think, pledged around 47 million euros to increasing defense around Greenland. They also have the serious dog sled, which is a really important way of traversing some of the high parts of Greenland. When it comes to on the ground, there's been actually a lot of increasing cooperation between the University of Greenland and the Royal Danish Defence College, really trying to build a lot more focus on what's happening on Greenland. How do we take the operational realities there and put them into the broader context of Danish defense and security? So I think they are moving more and more towards being involved, but for Denmark, the challenge with Greenland is it's been so important about its relationship to the United States, not about the defense of Greenland, but it's long been about this card, actually. And in the literature, there's talk about how Denmark has played this Greenland card within NATO. It's been a reluctant ally in some ways to the alliance. And so having Thule, having now Pituffik there, it was the way that Denmark justified less contributions to NATO than it has in the past.
Hi. In your assessment, what do you think it would take for Denmark to overturn the uranium mining ban to enable better access to critical minerals from Greenland?
I really don't imagine them doing that because I think it would be such a challenge to Danish-Greenlandic relations, which have already been tense in the past. They're united now, of course, from an outside threat. But to overturn that, I think, would cause a huge upset in not only that relationships, but also for a question for Greenland, right? So what does Greenland now have access to doing if they're now not able to focus on critical minerals?
Yeah, do you have a... Oh, sorry. Yeah, do you have any sense for how this recent push to acquire Greenland has altered Greenlandic politics? For example, is it helping to promote the pro-independence movement more? Or conversely, is it helping to push them, back closer towards Denmark?
I think it's really pushed them back to Denmark in a way. So of course there is, some degree of like a splinter movement that's interested, but it is so small to being interested with the United States. And I think a lot of the language about not working with Greenland but acquiring them has really led to a lot of Greenlandic politicians saying, well, perhaps we don't want to work with you at all. We've traditionally really sought out relations with the US, but now I think many Greenlandic parties, and in the recent election, we certainly saw this, that a party, they want independence, but they want to work much closely with Denmark in the near future. There's someone in the back up there.
Is the main downside that is perhaps preventing Greenland from declaring independence the money that it receives from Denmark?
Primarily, yeah. So I think the NATO stuff is there, but it's sort of a side issue. Really, it's a financial question about if Greenland became independent, how would they support the welfare of their citizens? Because right now, of course, Greenland being a part of the Kingdom of Denmark, they have social health care, for example. And so that's a lot of money to spend. And right now, Denmark covers that. But to become independent, they would not only have to cover that, but also, for example, a lot of the airport cost with running that, perhaps even some of the military costs as well for helping to defend the island as well.
Sorry to go twice, but that kind of raises a question. Like, there's this study of microstates, states of less than 1 million, and overwhelmingly, and once you strip out strange European tax havens like Monaco or Liechtenstein, what you have are insular, poor, commodity dependent, non-viable, and geopolitically extremely threatened tax havens. Like, does this broadly dispiriting set of countries influence the Greenlandic debate at all?
I think it's a good question, first of all. I don't know too much about the other microstates in Europe, but when it comes to Greenland, I think it's how they frame their role. And often it's how they decide to, I guess, identify themselves. So they don't often identify with these smaller states in Europe. Instead, they say, well, we're more akin to the small island states. We're threatened by climate change seriously, but we play a really important para-diplomatic role. We don't have the full sovereign status of a state to act in the international system, but we still play a really important role. And I think instead they really focus on working with Alaska, for example, as a state. They focus on working with more Inuit groups like the Inuit Circumpolar Council across Canada as well. And I think it's really how they, I suppose, decide to position themselves in the world.
I have a quick question. Have you been to Greenland yourself?
I have not, unfortunately. I sought to go during the PhD, but it was too challenging.
So I wanted to ask, following up on the questions about how things have changed within Greenlandic discussions, recently, like how Denmark's seen and those sorts of things. A two-part question, really. One is about Russia, because you sort of started off about Russia. You showed Mikhail Gorbachev, 1987. That's like a very particular kind of moment in and then it was a Soviet discussion. It's really different after 2022. And I'm wondering, how far has the new position of Russia geopolitically shaped Greenlandic discussions about security or about Greenlandic futures? And then secondly, to ask you to expand just a little bit on the EU part of it. Because not NATO, not security focus, not that sort of thing, but you said Greenland has this very different relationship towards the EU, but at the same time, many of the responses that kind of bolstered Greenlandic presence relative to the Trump administration came at a European level. So how are Greenlandic voices thinking about the EU as a possible kind of focus for the future?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right that since 2022, the Arctic has changed really rapidly when it came to security. I think it became this space where we were no longer talking about separating it from the rest of the world, but rather it being a really important part of European security as well. Interestingly, I think from a Russian perspective, they've really stayed out of the Greenlandic environment. And part of this has to do with the fact that I think for them, they see Greenland as part of the US sphere of influence, to use an old term. And so the way that the US acts in Greenland is, of course, not dissimilar to how we've seen Russia talk about Ukraine in the past. And I think for them, they're very happy to watch the US burn its own feet when it comes to Greenland. That said, I think since 2022, Russia has really shifted how it's talked about the Arctic, and even before 2022, actually. So they came out with a new Arctic strategy in 2020, and they saw this change from talking only about cooperating with all Arctic states on a multilateral level to working bilaterally with only specific Arctic states that they wanted to work with. So they've really changed their whole approach to the region, and increasingly have talked about bringing the BRIC states in to work together on Svalbard, for example, and increasingly working with China, although they don't really speak about China's role in Greenland in doing that, which is interesting. When it comes to the EU, so there was actually a referendum in Greenland where they voted that they didn't want to be a part of the EU in the late 1900s. But part of the reason why they did that is that the EU doesn't have a great history when it comes to the Arctic. So they are not an observer in the Arctic Council at all, actually. And that's because in the early 2000s, around 2009, they enacted this seal ban, where they said, we don't want seal products in the EU, not understanding that, of course, this is a key Indigenous and Inuit export. And so they got a lot of pushback from Arctic states because of this. And the EU also, in earlier iterations of its Arctic policy, which it's come out with since 2008, it's called initially for an Arctic treaty, which again, many Arctic states said, well, you're not an Arctic actor, so why are you talking about creating an Arctic treaty at all? So I I think they have this really interesting role where they've sought an Arctic engagement because, of course, some of their member states are in the Arctic, like Finland and Sweden and Denmark. But it's both half in and half out in a way. And I think for Greenland, they've been wary about the EU because of the fishing, because of the seal ban, many of these challenges. But increasingly, we've seen this perspective that for Greenland, they need to look, as you said, more towards Europe and not towards the United States. I think no one's under any illusions that the US is like the guarantor of security, not only in Greenland, but in Europe as well. But for Greenlanders and Europeans, they perhaps see more values with one another than we see with the US. So there's actually a good op-ed that came out from a colleague that talked about that Greenland should actually apply to be a member of the EU in of itself, which is an interesting perspective. I don't think there's been any recent polling of how Greenlanders want to or want not to be part of the EU. But as you said, there was statements first from those 8 European states and then from the Nordic states supporting Greenland, which interestingly did not come with one another. And I think a lot of this had to do with perhaps not only diplomatic maneuvering from Greenlanders, but from Denmark itself. There's someone in the back up there. Or am I blind? Let me see.
I know that Greenland recently built, and I believe it's open now, a new airport which can accept flights from like, I think directly from like New York and stuff.
Right, yeah.
I guess my question is, do you see further development in Greenland, particularly like from a tourist perspective, as becoming a positive influence or like a negative influence? I guess what do you see in Greenland's future regarding like increasing access to the island?
I think on one hand, it's positive from a financial perspective for Greenland, because of course this brings in more money, which is good for infrastructure, good for the people of Greenland. But as I think as we all have seen when we've traveled to very heavily tourist-heavy places, it has a lot of negative downstream impacts for the people living there. And so I think it will be a question of, as those numbers start to increase, and I do expect them to, particularly now that there is that direct flight, whereas before you had to fly to Iceland or to Copenhagen and then fly back to get to Greenland. So that was kind of a challenging way to get there. But I think as we see tourism increase, we'll see the way in which Greenlanders either like this or they don't like this. And perhaps they won't, and then there'll be more restrictions put on, for example, not only who can come, but perhaps, how many flights will there be per day? And to give you an opposite example, obviously there's been a really big increase in tourism to Japan, right? And we've seen in recent weeks and years that the Japanese government has started saying maybe there should be 2 tiers of prices for tourists visiting Japan versus people living in Japan, as prices has risen and risen. So it could be that something similar could be done on Greenland. But of course, it's not only a question of airports, right? It's a question of hotels. How many people can actually come to Greenland? Even if the flights are there, where are they going to stay? Where are they going to go? How many people are running excursions on the Greenland ice sheet, for example, or shipping tours? So I think it's beyond a question of just airports, but understanding if there's actually the structural capacity to host that increasing number of people. Yes.
Hi, I'm a little reluctant to ask you this question in public, and if you feel uncomfortable about answering it in public, I completely understand. So the first few times I went to Europe after Trump got elected, I wanted to talk to people in Europe about their opinions of Trump. I didn't want to offend anyone, and I would sort of start by saying, are you a fan of Trump by chance?
No.
And everyone was offended that I even asked that, because everyone hated him and thought he was insane or mentally ill or something or other, which, is a reasonable interpretation of his behavior, I have to say. Now, in his second term, he seems completely unhinged, frankly. I mean, look what he's done. He's invaded and kidnapped the president of Venezuela. He's assassinated the supreme leader of Iran. And, the Iranian government is a horrible, brutal regime, and I'm not defending it in any way. But if this is a precedent for every other country that they can just invade any country they want to, kidnap their leaders, assassinate their leaders, we're all going to be dead in a few years if every other country thinks that's a fine thing. And I'm just wondering if you feel comfortable answering, what is the current interpretation of or feelings about Trump in Europe, as far as you can tell?
Yeah. I think there's a couple different camps of people in Europe that about responding to Trump. The first, and I think maybe unrealistic camp, has to do with we just have to get through this term. You know, it's only a couple more years. We just have to outlast this, and we'll appease and say we agree with you on certain issues. Let's make it through this. But this is growing increasingly smaller over time because, of course, let's say Vance takes power next, right? So it's the same sort of policy. So I think the problem, though, is that, as I said, the US is the security guarantor for Europe, and part of the way that the defense planning works from a NATO perspective is it's heavily reliant on allied reinforcements coming across the Atlantic to support Europe. So for a lot of European states, there's this security reality and the fact that, of course, none of them agree with Trump's policies. And I think a good example of this is the Arctic Sentry operation, essentially where Europeans had to say, sure, we agree with you on Arctic security issues. Yeah, we can set up this operation. So appeasing him in a way, but still, I think, moving the focus away from Greenland. This is also a question of specific people. And as we know, when it comes to Trump, he's a very personalist. Thinks it really depends who he's spoken to before his most recent meeting or who he has a close golfing relationship with. And so the president of Finland is a really good case here. When there was some initial tensions with Greenland in 2025, the leader of Finland actually went to Trump and they went golfing together, and things actually had some degree of resolution in 2025 because of that close relationship. So I think, at least specifically for Northern Europe, you need to, or not you need to, but people need to say, is it a person that we're sending to Trump to bring down these tensions? Is it Mark Rutte from NATO? Or how are we going to draw upon these long-standing relations? So as one example, Norway considers the US one of the cornerstones of its national security, along with many other states in Europe. But specifically Norway for the US has a close operational relationship. They train together a lot of the time. And actually, if you ask many Norwegian politicians, they'll say that during the first Trump term, the US and Norwegian relationship was actually quite strong because they were able to say, we agree on Russia. We agree on spending more money on defense together in the Arctic. And so I think for Europeans, it's a question of finding areas where they can draw some sort of agreement and focusing on that, drawing his attention away from areas where we all consider this really challenging.
Hi, I had a,
Oh, yeah.
yes, I had a question. Are there any movements among Indigenous people throughout the Arctic in the different countries that go across boundaries? Are there any efforts to unite them?
Absolutely, yeah. So there are many Indigenous groups in the Arctic, so I'll only draw on two, which is the Inuit and the Sami. And so the Inuit population goes across Alaska, Canada, and Greenland. And so there's the Inuit Circumpolar Council that's been around for a really long time. And they have specific regional groups. So there's the ICC Alaska, the ICC Nunavut, the ICC Greenland, and they are able to cooperate together on these things. And then the Sami parliament is in Finland, but the Sami people are stretched across the European Arctic. And so they do work together on a variety of different areas. Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure how or what I'm asking, but I'm interested in power in Greenland, and uranium mining is banned, so nuclear seems to not really be an option. But especially with increased tourism, it seems like there may be a bigger power draw. And so what is their current power situation? I don't know if you know this, but are they reliant on Denmark, or do countries have such as China or the United States, a lot of incentive to invest in power, or is it not as big of a debate as I think it may be?
I don't know too much about the degree of power, how that works there, but I guess what I could probably say is that the US and Greenland do have really long-standing economic relationships, so I would be really surprised if there wasn't some degree of bilateral company-to-company cooperation on these issues, but probably a lot of the infrastructure is funded by Denmark and Greenland, but again, I don't know specifically. Yes, there's someone in the back there. Yes, hopefully soon.
So that's very exciting. I was curious, what's your direction from here on out?
Yeah, so I have two big projects I'm working on at my current position. The first has to do with Nordic defense cooperation. And so for me, it's kind of interesting to say I want to move the aperture south to look at the Nordics, even though normally that we consider them really north. But in a way, it's a really interesting part of Europe because if you look at the Nordics, they've been cooperating for a really long time, since the 1950s from their foreign ministers, and even from defense cooperation since 2009 through NORDEFCO. But also things have changed really rapidly since 2015, 2022. There's a million defense cooperation agreements, access agreements, increasing exercises. And so my project is seeking to understand how should we actually understand this? And so there's a political science literature that talks about security communities, essentially groups of states that won't go to war with one another. And the Nordics are talked about as this ideal, this like amazing type of them. But I was thinking, it's clearly not only ideal, right? There's something really complicated here. So the book is focused on creating a more contested and nuanced understanding of what Nordic security community is, focusing on that at the core. There are convergences and divergences, so long-standing historical relations with one another, linguistic ties, but of course divergences, not only when it comes to their strategic geographic orientation, either towards the Baltic, North Atlantic, or Arctic, but also in the past, how they dealt with Russia, although this has changed quite rapidly since 2022. The other part of that equation is, of course, the role of military exercises and understanding them, not only as the numbers saying, hey, these have been increasing since 2014, but also what do they tell us about how states are moving things in particular areas and focusing areas on particular parts of where Northern Europe is. And then, of course, the role of informal relations that come out from that. So that's the book projects. And then the other project looks at hybrid threats in the European Arctic. So these kinetic under the threshold, not only kinetic, but kinetic and non-kinetic challenges under the threshold of armed conflict. And so part of that project is conceptualizing where did the term actually come from? Was it a think tank who used it first? Was it a state who used it first? And how did it move across the region as we saw instrumentalized migration in 2015, the cable cutting incidents, all of these types of challenges? And then comparing that to other parts of Europe, like the Black Sea as well as the Baltic Sea, because we always say hybrid threats are increasing in Europe, but this is not theoretically or empirically precise enough. So the work is trying to untangle where are the threats, how do we talk about them, and are they actually similarities how Russia and other state actors are acting parts across Europe?
Well, I don't see other hands, and actually I think that's a lovely note on which to end, a sense of where Dr. Gricius is headed next. Would you all join me in thanking her for being with us today?